You may have seen before, who will be talking about CQRS. Feel free to heckle. Richard can take it. I'm very sensitive. Yeah, Richard's a great guy. Take it away. All right, hi everyone. Hi, hello. How are you? I'm good, thank you very much. I'm looking for something to throw. All I can come up with is this.
The C# for Java developers.
Hang on. Yeah, you can take the beautiful data. Look it out. It's fresh, actually. You can tell by the fact the pages are white that no one reads this stuff. Jubal, oh, the MB. WCF for everything book. All right. So last month, got a question from one of the guys. Can't even remember who it was, who said, can we do a session on CQRS? Was it you, was it? Okay. And what the whole thing's all about, what the pattern's about, etc. So I went, yeah, I'll try and find a speaker. And then I forgot. And then I remembered last week that we have to have a topic and put that in there. And so I went, yeah, I found my speaker by looking in the mirror, and here I am. So thank you, Richard, for inviting me. It's a pleasure. So we're going to go through this. Who likes peas, by the way? You are all sick individuals and you need medical attention. And if you ever mix peas and potato together, it's a horrible thing. And that's as far as the metaphor goes. All right, so CQRS, what it stands for is very straightforward, Command Query Responsibility Separation. Who's come across this so far? Just so I know. All right, a few of you. Who's heard of a command? Okay, who's heard of a query? Who's heard of separation? Guys, do you know what responsibility is? Okay. Yeah, no hands go up there. No idea. We're all irresponsible. So commands are very simple in terms of dev, in terms of any pattern. Commands are simply something that will update the state of an object. Generally, a command has no return value. A command succeeds or it fails. That's it. So you don't need to return anything. Most commands are voids. If there's a problem, you simply return an exception because the command didn't work for whatever reason. But the assumption is you make a command, it changes state, end of story. Queries, on the other hand, read that state out of wherever you're storing it and just return data. Now, it doesn't have to return the domain objects or anything like that. I'm standing on my bag, don't do that. And generally, a query, as you would expect, shouldn't have any side effects. If you ever do a get of something and it changes state, it's going to be kind of weird to behave, weird behavior in the application. You're not going to trust what it's doing because every time you do a read, something weird happens. We don't want that. So easy example, we don't want that, even though people are going, yeah, that's our code. Example, HTTP verbs. Okay, this is really easy. We all use the web. We should all know what most of these verbs are. So query examples are things like the get. Strangely enough, you do a get, it gets you some data. You do the same get, it gets you some data. It's very exciting. A get to a web server shouldn't have any side effects. Shouldn't. It might do something in a log file or something like that, but it's not going to change the state of the application, if that makes sense. Same with the head verb, options, trace, etc. Fairly straightforward. On the other hand, commands, things that will change state on your web server, are going to be things like put, post, patch, and delete. Strangely enough, delete will change the state of something. Gets rid of it. That's a state change, isn't it? Pretty sure.
No one's laughing at your joke. Move on.
Plus, can I just point out real quick?
Yes, please rescue me from that terrible person over there.
CQRS is Command and Query Responsibility Segregation and Separation.
Whatever. It doesn't matter, right?
Your first slide is wrong.
See, that was a good joke. Your first hint was a good joke.
All right, now, is it, by the way, Omar, is it CQS or CQRS? Because if you look, you'll see both. On the web, if you look this stuff, you'll see CQS and CQRS. So the difference between the two is fairly straightforward. Now, if the S word is wrong,
I'll ignore it.
I'm going to let Mr. Pedantic sort that out for us.
That's correct there.
But the
Actually, that one is correct.
That's correct.
Yeah, in your face.
Richard, command says separation, Fowler says segregation.
Well, they're both wrong.
They're both racists, as far as
Oh, jeez, all right. I don't speak on behalf of any audience members here. Their opinions are entirely their own, and I don't want to be held accountable for what Omar says. So the idea with CQS, this is the very early original pattern. The idea is, in one class you have separate methods for doing commands and doing queries. But the key thing is it's in one class. Okay, so one interface has methods for commands, methods for query. Fairly straightforward. And if we were to look at that, you would see something like this, which basically has, if it was C#, we've got methods here that are setting the active state to true or false, depending on which method we're calling. And we query that through that method there, the get, on a property. That's at its simplest, right? Fairly straightforward. That's a good start. If your application doesn't do something like that and you just allow people to set values in your properties, then you don't have any real behavior in your application, you just have a property bag. In certain cases, that's perfectly fine. No problem at all. There are a suite of applications where CRUD-style operations like that are perfectly legitimate. That's why Microsoft created LightSwitch. That's all I know. CQRS, note that I didn't bother putting the explanation here because I didn't want to be picked up on what the S means, is that we basically have separate classes. So we're separating out the responsibilities into separate classes. A class for handling commands and classes for handling queries. And we're separating them out. Why? Good question. We'll get to that. But if we were looking at it, we'd end up with a code that looks a little bit like this now. So here's that user account thing. I've still got these active and deactive methods, but I'm marking them internal. I don't want to expose these publicly and let people use them because I'm going to access those through command objects that I create that will change my domain object. So this is my domain object. This is where my logic lives. This is where state lives. There's not a whole lot of state there, obviously. And I might have a query service that queries that state. It looks a little like this. I start off with a database of some variety, whatever. It's sample code, so don't pick on it too much. I didn't even compile this stuff. I just wrote it. Shh. You're not meant to tell the audience that, by the way. You're meant to pretend this is real code. But the idea here is that we have a database. We might have some queries on it. An object, find by name or active accounts. And those are going to return me data to my consumers. So as a consumer, I'm going to request things. Now at the moment, there's a bit of an anti-pattern going on in here where I'm returning domain objects back to my end users. I'm only doing that for the sample code. In a real application, what would I be returning instead?
A DTO.
A DTO of some variety. Data that is shaped specifically to the needs of the consumer. Put my teeth back in, consumer. So find by name, I might return an account ID and maybe one other property or something like that, if that was my need. Whereas active accounts, that would be a list, enumerable, whatever else. But I might not be returning all user accounts, I'd be returning some DTOs. Because what I don't want to do is I don't want to expose all my internals, all my state of every object back to my consumers. That way opens up all sorts of problems. It's overexposing data, at least the security leaks. You know, I don't want to send passwords back, for example. User accounts generally have passwords on them. Probably don't want to expose that. Do we GitHub? Rails. Mass assignment attack. So just be aware of that. Command handler on the other side, a separate object for handling commands. I have a constructor which is going to take in a query service and a logger of some variety maybe. And then I'm going to have this command here called activate account, which takes a parameter being whatever the properties are that I need for that command. So in this case it's fairly simple. It would just be an account name. I want to activate this particular account if that was the key, or an ID, or whatever it happens to be. I try and grab the account, then I call the activate method on it in here, inside my command handler, and then I might do some logging or something like that. Note that if this fails, I'm catching the error, and logging it, and then I'm just rethrowing it back to my consumer, and they can deal with it however it makes sense to them. Question?
I want to ask about eventual consistency.
You can ask later. I'll get to it.
Oh,
Okay.
I'll get to it.
nice joke.
It's a weird sense of humor over there. Yeah.
You'll eventually get
Account query service, is that, I just need to get it cleared up. The account query service, is that in place of your repository, or are you actually reading out from the read model in the command line?
What repository?
Okay. Account query service, is that the one you're using for your queries as well?
Yeah, at the moment. It's sample code.
Okay.
It's just to keep it concise.
Yeah, that's fine.
Because it's more the concept than anything else. So we've got one object for doing commands, one object for doing queries. Straightforward, right? So first reaction is, why am I writing so much extra code? Damn it. Because I get paid by lines of code. There we go. So yeah, it's more code, but it's more expressive, it's more intentional. If I'm doing an application where there is complexity in the domain, I want to have expressive code. If I have to infer meaning based on UI behavior, then it's going to be really hard to maintain, it's hard to test, it's hard to figure out what's going on. Someone else comes and maintains my code and their first reaction is, who wrote this? And then you can insert swear word here or whatever you like. Or because there's no intention in the code, they don't know what changes to make. So we end up with behavior living in here, behavior over here, business rule here, bug over there, we don't know what's going on. And it just gradually devolves into a bit of a mess. The spaghetti mud ball horror thing that we commonly know as legacy code.
Rewrite.
Rewrite's the only solution, right? Yeah, always. Anyone went to DDD? Yeah. So Udi's keynote was all about making sure you can sell the rewrite properly. Yeah. All right, now question about persistence. Where should persistence go? So back in this code here, I made a state change, but that's not saved to a database anywhere. So where does persistence go? Do I put it in an MVC or an API controller? So I make my state change and then I save. Do I put it in the user account class? So I have in my state method where I'm changing state of the object, do I put it there so that it's at the point where the change occurs? Do I put it elsewhere? What do I do? Question for you guys.
Elsewhere.
Where's the elsewhere?
Repository.
Another command.
Another command, yes. A command called save, which lives on a repository of some variety or a database. And we just put db save straight after we've done the method to change state. We don't want it happening inside the domain object because that's not persistence ignorance. We want the domain object to be just something that controls state and behavior but doesn't care how it's stored. We want the caring of how it's stored to be in a repository of some variety, and we would just want to call a method on that inside our command handler. Easiest way to do it. That way all our changes are encapsulated, constrained, and easy to spot. Question again? Is this going to be eventual consistency or event sourcing or something?
Account command handler will
Yep.
know about database.
Yep.
Intentional.
Yep.
Okay.
For now.
What would you prefer?
JavaScript.
JavaScript. You win the night. All right. Now there's differences between query services and query objects, but it's somewhat semantic. A query service is an object that has and supports multiple queries on a particular domain, things like that. A query object supports one. Okay? Why would I have a difference between the two? Why do I care? Query objects are, again, a bit more discrete around what we're doing, and it's where we've got less code accreting in a single class, so we don't end up with the God query service. And then the new developer comes along and says, oh, there's a query service here with all these queries related to accounts, but I need something related to logins. I could just add that here at the bottom because that's where all the other security stuff is. Flappy hands. And then we end up with code just turning up in our query services that no longer relate to the purpose of the object they were created in. Make sense? So query objects, single query each time, more discrete, easier to test, less change, less chance of having conflicts in code with other developers also changing the query service, for example. because occasionally you have to work with other people. I know bosses that force people to do that. It's so mean. So we might have something like this, an active accounts query, which is a query to get me the number of active accounts, or the list of active accounts, I should say. It implements an interface called iQuery, which has on it a single thing called execute. Okay? In this case, we're returning an IEnumerable of whatever the DTO is. Again, pseudocode. It's not compilable because it's not at the moment. But you get the idea, right? So we're passing in a context for the database or a data source that we're going to query against. We're doing db.all where it's active and returning it as a toList so that we enumerate the query, get a result, all that sort of stuff with LINQ. Happy days. Single object, really easy to test. Really easy to deal with other code as well in terms of getting data in a shape back that I need if I'm doing unit testing of other code. Fair enough? All right, and again, as you can see, more of these, more code. But again, more intentional code. Question?
Richard, would you start with the query service and then refactor it into the query objects, or would you go straight to query objects?
Don't care. I really don't. I want to build what's needed at the time. So I would probably just start with query service until it gets maybe more than 5 or 10 queries in it. And then I'd probably start thinking about separating it out because there's getting to be too much in there. That's me because I've got enough experience to know when to do that switch. If I'm working with a team with a bunch of junior devs, I'd probably start with query objects straight away because they tend to follow that monkey see, monkey do pattern of development. We've all been there, right? Some of us are still there. Yeah. And for me, I do exactly the same thing. If I see it on a blog post, I just copy it. Or Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a bit of that, and I'm just going to make a judgment call.
A small question about any tips and tricks how to, where to put these query objects, because they can be like thousands of query objects.
They could be, but there's a thing in C# called namespacing.
Yep. So it will be the same
Tricky.
essentially as like service, but in namespaces.
How would I namespace this? Is that
Yeah,
the question?
I mean it will be essentially the same as service object, but you place it in namespace and separate by classes.
Yeah. I would tend to also group these based on the type of data they're related to. So these would be query objects related to the accounts, because that's the sort of thing we're querying on. Or it could be something security or users or whatever makes sense in the domain. Yeah.
Is there something in naming you use account query service, but account command handler?
Yep. Wherever it was. Account query service there. Yep.
And account command handler?
Yep.
Any reason why?
Because the command handler is only handling one command. If I have multiple commands I was handling in here, I'd probably call it a service instead. So services for me anyway, I tend to think of those as things that handle multiple responsibilities or multiple methods versus objects like this, handlers or whatever else that tend to be just one.
Sorry, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you can also model queries as queries and query handlers, where the query is the DTO and the query handler basically.
Yeah, you can.
Out.
Yeah. So the point there is that this query object, you could call this an active account query handler, and it takes as its parameter a query instead of this. Oh, I got nothing on here actually, because I'm just getting everything in this case. But if I was doing the find by name or something like that, I would take that string and I'd call it a find by accounts by name query object. But it's basically an object for my parameter list or my query parameters, and then I'd use that.
Any preference?
No. Whatever makes sense with the team. Don't get too hung up on the implementation. It's the pattern that's important, and it's the separation that's important. So thinking about these things separately, commands and queries separately, makes a big change to how you architect your application. Worth thinking about. All right, now the question is, now that we've got these query handlers and we've got these command handlers, just using handlers everywhere, should we drop the activate and deactivate methods from the user account class? Because it's doubling the code now, right? It's an easy refactoring, just remove them. We don't really need to do it. We're only accessing the domain object from our command handler. So it's already isolated and encapsulated in the assembly. So consumers aren't going to be able to access things directly. So now I've just got a method there that's only used internally. Why not just get rid of it? Especially when it's just calling a property setter. Just nuke it, right? Seems reasonable?
Yes.
Seems like a refactoring I do. Because I'm a bit silly, but we end up then with the anemic domain model, which is effectively just a property bag, which is cool. Bool is active, get, internal set, like just call that. Happy days. But now my domain has no behavior. Where is my behavior encapsulated?
Services.
Services. Well, maybe we should call them managers as well. Who likes that?
Or
Class is
engines.
called manager.
Engines?
Engines. I don't see those very often. I see managers, services, and service managers. Oh, there's more? Juval says, yeah, okay.
engines, yeah.
So, is an anemic domain model okay? So the consultant answer is always. There we go. Okay, you've all got a job in consulting. Renifi's hiring, just so you know. That's all we look for. In an interview, if we ask you a question, just say, it depends. You're hired.
Damn it, I have interviews coming up with people.
Oh, sorry. Game the system.
It's never okay.
It's never okay. Not true. It depends. If your application is a cruddy application, that's okay. How often do you build CRUD apps? Forms over data. You're not doing any behavior. It's literally just a UI that dumps stuff in a database. How often do you do those? Or how often are parts of your application shaped like that? Which is also important. So you don't have to apply CQRS to your whole application. If part of your application is just CRUD operations, like lookup tables, for example, where you're just putting in reference data, there's no behavior, you just put in values. Key description, key description, key description. Do I need to go and CQRS that thing?
But then it's not really a domain model at all.
That's right. That part is not a domain model. It's just a dumping ground for data. There is no domain model. Well, technically there is, but it's really simple. And there's no behavior there. But in the user account place, what happens when behavior changes? If I've gotten rid of those properties, where does my behavior end up? In the command handler or the service or the
Stored prop.
service manager service, stored prop. Stored prop, yes. And the JavaScript engine that we're using to write to the database. So let's say we need a validated email before we can make the account active. It's a fairly simple rule. If that was there, this is our new behavior that's going in. If the email is not validated, we throw an exception when we try and activate. Fair enough. If that's like that, and my command handler is literally just calling activate, then I'm done. I make that change, I write a test, I'm finished, move on. If it's in a handler, that logic, then I have to make sure I capture every single handler that might call that method and make sure I've changed them consistently. Kind of avoids single responsibility, doesn't it?
ReSharper.
Misses the point. ReSharper is going to help me do that, that's okay.
That's ReSharper driven development.
As long as that's green, it's good, right? So that's why we do that. Even though it might feel like you're repeating code and a lot of the things are just fall-through methods when you're doing simple cases, when you add complexity and as behavior changes and enhances over time, you get the benefits of having already set yourself up to win. So this is where we take in that architectural principle of building for today with an expectation of change but not actually implementing the change at that point. So design principles, separation of concerns and single responsibility. That's really what we're talking about. So domain classes are responsible for their behaviors. Unless you've got an anemic domain. In which case there is no responsibility for anything because there's no behavior. They're responsible for holding data. Great, well done. Command handlers are responsible for coordinating state changes. And using repositories to persist, fair enough again, we've gone through that. And the query objects are obviously responsible for getting data back and just returning in a shape however the consumer wants. Now note that if we do that, we're avoiding the domain. We're just going straight to the database and asking questions of it. there is no reason to go via domain objects to get data back in a shape a consumer needs. They just want a bit of data. They're not thinking about a domain object. They're just going, give me some info for this query. What is it? End of story. So don't go through the business rules. Don't go through any of the processing. Don't try and rehydrate state. Just hit the database and get the data. Make sense? So, what's it mean for your architecture? It means we get boxes and lines, baby. Love boxes and lines. And yes, that's $5,000 a day. Thank you very much. I wish. So commands come from the UI. They go into our app. The app updates the domain, and then those changes get persisted. Now, it's not the domain persisting it, but you get the idea, simplifying the diagram. Queries, on the other hand, get received by the application from the UI and simply hit the database and return it. Job done, happy days. Give yourself a pay rise. I don't know how, you don't control your own pay. Ooh, that's a little bit small, that picture, sorry about that. So the idea here is, if you think about the entire application, we have the UI, and we kind of have these left half, right half, left brain, right brain, or groom side, bride side, depending on how you want to think about it. So the UI is coming in, making queries, hitting the database, creating a projection of the data to send back. Commands come down on this side, get picked up by the service handlers, query thingy, object stuff, green box, get processed by the blue box and put into the round blue shape, being the database. Now, when we change state, this query store here is where we start talking about denormalizing data. If you think about the fact that we don't have to go through our domain objects to get data and query it, we can optimize our application for read performance and take all our state here, denormalize it here so that our queries are simply single read queries. There are no joins. There is no spoon. You know, you've got to throw a matrix reference in somewhere. But if you denormalize it, you can make most of your complex queries single read operations, order one type stuff. We like that because it's really performant, really fast. And if you've got caching happening as well, you can do this in Redis and you can get massive performance boost. Massive. Also means that by separating things out, if you've got a read-heavy or a write-heavy application, you can scale parts of your application independently so that you can suit your needs. So Stack Overflow, which we all use, is a read-heavy application. Definitely. So they already pre-compute the pages for most of the questions that get asked, you know, out of their million, billion questions. Most of those are already cached in Redis, pre-computed with results ready to go. And they have a little listener that sits on the web page. When someone posts an answer, they update the domain model here. And they push a message to say this page has been updated, and you just go and refresh the cache. And you see that when, you know, it says one new reply if you've been sitting on a question for too long. Really common situation. Great for performance, helps them scale massively and keep the performance so quick. That's why their site is so responsive. Because if you think about what that would take to hit the database every time, to get a question and all the answers and all the votes and all the comments, the amount of I/O that is crazy. The site wouldn't perform anywhere near as fast. Most pages would take at least a second to load. You know, it's all good. All right, so commands, in terms of designing commands, thinking about them, should describe a single intention from your user. Single, okay? Such as open account, reset the password, disable an account, whatever else. And we're generally doing it against a single entity. Question?
Sorry, Richard.
Yep.
Something like a created account.
Yep.
There's a common pattern where you sort of return the ID of what you create. Is that sort of anti-pattern in this case?
So how does create account work generally? You have information you're passing through to get it, to set that account up. If you're sending a request and there's basically a void response, it either works or it didn't, do you really care about the ID in the UI? Or can you get that by waiting for the query to respond, the command. I've got to keep them separate in my head. Wait for the command to respond, say yes, it's been processed and done, and then use the information you already sent to create the account and just make a query to get the information you need. Or even better, you simply say, yes, the account's created in the UI. Creation successful. Now what do you want to do?
Yes,
So there's a change to how you think about that instead.
but in some cases, assume now after we create an account, if you
Yep.
want to do some subsequent operation using that ID, say I want to create some entity attached into that account,
Yep.
and you customer somebody.
Yep.
So in that particular case, we need the account because in practically, yeah.
Yep.
So
What do you need though? You need the account ID.
Yeah.
So you make a query.
So, but we
answer
don't know,
that?
and that account created and that.
It's a change to how you think
Yeah.
about things, right? And it does your head in a little bit, but go ahead.
Do you mind, Brian?
Yeah, jump in, jump in. I'll just sit
sorry.
here and look great.
No worries. ID generation, first of all, you gotta avoid that ID generation happens in the database. Many of these patterns depend on you generating GUID up front.
Yeah.
And then while creating the entity, you've got that GUID handy anyway. If you want to query later, even to make sure that the entity is persisted, you use that GUID. In general, where the world is going architecturally, try and avoid generating stuff on the database anyway. Define your own ID strategy outside.
Yeah. Then I have a question on because
Did you hear that, by the way?
Yeah, I did sort of know
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
it.
You got a little bit.
Another way.
Basically, you said generate a GUID for your ID. Do it up front. If we've got there's a .NET project called Snowmaker as well, which does automatic ID generation. Basically, grabs a pool of numbers if you want to do integers instead, and you use up those integers, but you'd be willing to have gaps.
That's what Tathan's one, right?
Yeah,
It's very
yeah.
handy,
It's
yeah.
similar to what
Yeah.
Twitter does with tweet numbers and things like that. So you create a tweet, it just grabs a number from the pool, it gives a block, and then you just use them up, and then when it's done, it goes, oh, you need a new block? Okay, make another query, I'll give you another block of numbers. And away you go.
another question now.
Yep.
What do you think about using GUID as an ID?
What
Or
do I think about GUID as an ID?
GUID against using a normal integer because we know that usually integers are faster when we links and when we search something rather than GUID.
So this is a database question. Should I
Yeah.
use GUIDs or ints in my keys in my database?
It depends.
You heard.
Can we have your resume later?
It is a database question,
It's
but because you've got CQRS, you've got a read model, you can actually change your ID strategy up
You
there.
can.
Yep.
You can use the GUID as your client-generated key. If you want to stick it an ID as the primary key, it's just another column.
I think GUIDs for primary keys have like lots of severe kind of fill factor problems, so it's a real impact to use.
Used to.
Yeah, okay.
SQL 2014 and 16 have done some stuff to improve that
So-
anyway.
In a RESTful architecture, you generally generate some kind of identifier and pass it back, like a resource identifier, pass it back to the caller, and then they poll that. So it might not be ready yet, okay, I'll call it back in a few seconds, so you poll it until the work, again, it goes back to eventual consistency. It might fail, and you might never get an ID, it's just a temporary identifier that you recycle. You wouldn't make them unique for the whole lifetime of the app. So that kind of thing, you know. Does that make sense?
It depends.
I use timestamp. I find that's really accurate. To the second. As long as we're created in that second, it's fine. Or just random numbers from someone's keyboard. Just type in an ID for us.
Math, not random.
Yeah. Don't seed it though. Now, thinking about commands and all that sort of stuff does lead us towards domain-driven design. Who's aware of this? Heard of at least? Used? Okay. Used poorly? Thank you for your honesty. Yeah. Okay. There's a few terms you just need to be aware of. I'm not going to go deep into this at the moment. This is a run over the surface. But basically, an entity is an object that has some sort of discrete life cycle. It creates, it lives. It's identified by some thing, some sort of tag identifier. It might be a GUID. But generally, I don't think of you guys as GUIDs. Probably not. I know. But definitely has an identity versus a value object where we don't really care about the identity. It's really just a property bag. It's identified by the values in properties more than anything else. So street addresses are normally the things, or colors or whatever else, yeah. Aggregate is a grouping of multiple entities together. Hopefully you remember some of this from your OO classes at some point, if you actually got a formal education. Looking around the room again, I'm not going to make that assumption. But are clustered together as a coherent whole. So you get the example of like a chair, for example, which has a back and a seat and then 4 legs, or 1 leg in this case. But when they're put together, that's an aggregate, and we call it a chair, that sort of stuff. The aggregate root that you hear talked about, or that you see on blogs and so forth, is that single class you use to access the aggregate. And then the context is in which we have meaning around that. So a chair in, well actually not that, an account in a security context is someone's login. An account in a banking context is somewhat different. Probably don't want to get the two mixed up. Question?
Does object composition somehow relate to aggregate?
Composition and aggregation? No, not necessarily.
Okay.
It's not to be mixed up with the composite design pattern or anything like that.
Composite application blocks?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No end-lib. No. All right, so if you think about this and you think about your domain context, when you try and create modular code, whether it's a monolith or some service-based application, and of varying sizes, whether they're macro services, MIDI services, or DNC readable microservices, all of those should have some sort of context around them. There's some sort of boundary. We really want you to think about that when you're putting your app together, because those contexts are important. A command lives within a certain context, and it helps you structure your application better. So commands act on the aggregate roots in that context and do things in that context. And then if you want to cross context, we do things to go across the domain context with domain events, things like that. All right, queries on the other hand, you just need to get data. So as we said, why go via the domain objects? It doesn't make sense. Just hit it directly, as we talked about before. And denormalize the data. It's perfectly okay. The DBAs will get upset because they'll go, we've got no space in our SAN. What happens to my beautiful database? And they'll cry. And they'll have tears. And we're developers, so what do? We laugh with that evil laugh. You have to start a little bit, ha ha ha, and then ha ha ha, and then you just get, silly. Or, you know what? Let them store stuff in their database in third normal form and be beautiful and crazy that no one can ever use. And we can go and dump stuff somewhere else in our own NoSQL database. Mongo, because it's web scale. Or Hadoop, or Azure Table Storage. I really don't care. Optimize for read performance. Why not? Go nuts. There's no rules saying you can't do that, other than company policy that says, it's different. What do we do for support? It's always the first question, right? But why not? Store it in a different database. If the DBAs don't want to let you touch their third normal form, beautifully designed entity model, stick it in another SQL database that's just a bunch of tables, all optimized based on each query. And then watch them get all scared about all the data duplication going on. And how will we ever keep it in sync? Now the question is, how do we keep things in sync? Let's say we split the storage between SQL database and an alternate data storage mechanism. How do we keep it in sync? Because this leads to what? Eventual consistency, yes. So if it was different tables or different database on the same DB server, for example, you could just do a transaction, wrap it around the whole thing, so you update your domain models and you update your read models or your query views or whatever you want to call them at the same time. If it's a single database server. Try to avoid anything where you get to a distributed transaction, because I'm pretty sure that hell is not fire and brimstone. Hell is debugging distributed transactions.
On SQL Server, indexed views seem to be gaining more and more.
That's good to know. So indexed views. Could you do your read models or your query views as indexed views? If you wish. But what happens under the hood?
Replication of data.
Yeah, they're effectively doing that for you. Or, you can do triggers. I don't mind.
Why not?
DBAs like it. It's just denormalizing data. It's actually perfectly valid. I know, you're going to shoot me later, burn me at the stake, all that sort of stuff, but that's a valid use for triggers.
It's 2014.
It's a really horrible maintainability choice because, again, if you're going to change your schema or you want a new query, you have to go into all your database tables and change the schema. Generally, that's not going to go down well. But it's an option. Just don't have triggers firing triggers, firing triggers, firing triggers, firing triggers. You get the idea.
Cross-database inserts using triggers.
Yes! What could possibly go wrong? Or we could think about eventual consistency. And that's the idea now. When we have our design, we update our domain model and we create an event of some variety that pushes message to another database which then goes and updates the read model. But it's done out of sync. It's an async process. We don't want to do that synchronously. So as we said, the domain entity changes state. We raise a domain event. So if you go into the blue book, is it actually here? I thought it was somewhere. Anyway, domain, don't worry about it. Oh, it's back there if you're interested later. But domain events are basically things that have happened past tense in your domain to indicate what occurred. So I do a command, I change state. The domain event is saying that state has changed. So account created is a domain event, create account is a command. Make sense? So we just start modeling things that way. Those domain events, if you think about them, are really easy to turn into messages and publish into a message queue, get picked up by a subscriber, processed, used to update domain view, read views, query models, whatever else. Done asynchronously. It does imply a change to how you architect though, because you have to think about that eventual consistency in your application. What does it mean to my UI now? Because users are often used to things having this sense of being immediate. I make a change, everywhere else if I go and look for that data now I'm going to be current. Of course I'm not really current. I'm out of date by however long it's been since the data was refreshed. But that's the idea. So we then end up with event handlers, which are very much like command handlers. They listen to an event, they subscribe, and then they update the state of our views, our query views. If you progress further down this path, you will get to start thinking about event sourcing. I'm not going to touch on that at the moment. Other than to say the idea is that we store, instead of in a database, we store all our domain events as the database, and then we query those events. And we have an event stream, we replay them to restore state, and there's a question. Okay, go on.
So eventual consistency question I'm going to ask
Yep.
is following. I was trying to do the CQRS twice,
Yep.
and both times I hit the following problem. My database is clustered, say Cassandra,
Okay.
Couchbase, doesn't matter.
Yep.
The problem is that it eventual consistent.
Mm-hmm.
In some events, in some cases, I needed the data written with a, like, let's say, post request.
Yep.
And then I need the new, let's say, data from the database returned, or at least either the
So you were
the
sending...
revision number. The revision
Okay.
number. So
Yep.
these are key value stores. Let's say it's a
Yep.
key value store. Each key value have a revision.
Yep.
And I need this new revision each time. So
Mhm.
it provided by database. Unfortunately, it's eventually consistent and it can take up to several seconds. So my users suffer with large delays, and my clients wanted it to be snappy. So I had to abandon CQRS twice because of that. Do you have any suggestions?
So
Yeah,
just so I'm clear,
event source.
you're sending a command to the domain, it's updating a persisting state, and it's persisting in Cassandra.
Yep.
Which is itself is an eventually consistent
Yep.
database. So you're getting queries off a different node in Cassandra, which has not yet got the results.
The
Is that what
right
we're talking
request to
Because the command succeeds, right?
Wait,
So
wait,
the UI is
wait.
not making a request until the command succeeds.
yes.
Or you are.
Yes. So Couchbase. Let's talk about Couchbase because it's
Yep.
what I'm describing right now. It's got key value pairs. It's
Yep.
a key value store. Whenever you write something, it returns you back the new value.
Yep.
Sometimes it can be returned in several seconds. The new revision number.
The
Okay.
database itself, Couch itself,
Yeah.
is taken.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
Because
it's like a database generated,
Yep.
not a DB.
So the DB itself is the problem, right?
Couchbase
So-
has a write buffer, and it will not persist to disk until it's filled the buffer to a certain point. Then it will flush the disk,
Got it.
because it's much better to do the batch insert. If you need to get the record back and do something with it in the meantime, I guess the only way would be to put it into a much more synchronous key value database.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
that's one, or the force the flush out of the buffer.
Or do that.
Don't
So-
force the flush.
Except you're going to
It's-
make it
I'm
happen.
just
It's
saying.
going to
Yeah.
slow the entire database
So
down.
what I'm trying to say
Yep.
is that this limitation, basically the limitation, you
Yep.
limit queries and writes.
Yep.
We just forgot one of the limitations saying that the comments should return nothing. Our comments were returning something. So that's
yeah, okay.
basically
So then you have to wait for that to come back.
so.
So this is where you have to start really thinking about the design. So as we were talking about, if it was keys or versioning or something like that, you would bring back a default version number. We've just done the create, so our v is going to be 1. Or we're going to track in the client. We've just done a command, so when it returns, we'll update our version number to v+1.
So anybody with CQRS experience have that experience that you had to return something from your comments? Commands.
I would expose the inner asynchronous workflow to the client in such a way that the user knows that the request is being processed. So that way the view reflects the actual state of the system.
Yeah,
You're
but
not
with
trying to check.
Couchbase, that
You
can
don't
be
have
several
that.
seconds. in fact.
It's the database itself that's
Yeah.
the problem.
Oh yes, so no, so the view's going to say, I'm doing some work.
It shouldn't be. That was the client request.
Yeah.
Do not have the spinner.
It's something like
But the spinner solves everything.
it's something like every 1,000 requests it will do a flush.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, you
So
either
you
have
don't
to
have enough
it's
customers.
spinnable.
You don't have enough customers. The business problem is there's not enough customers, I'm sorry.
So the trade-off, you just run it locally, and there's a trade-off there between synchronicity
Yeah,
and
sure.
scale.
Yeah, I
So
know.
your client needs to decide whether they want it now and just block everybody's.
I understand.
Yeah.
That's my problem. But
Yeah.
the question was different. Do you ever broke the command pattern? As a,
So if you've tried to implement CQRS, have you tried that, the send a command and get a result back?
No.
Because if you think about it, if you send a command and you're trying to get data back from the command, you've actually joined your commands and your queries. Because queries are where we return data. It's an easy trap to fall into because it's very
it a trap?
CRUD-like in behavior.
is it a trap?
Yeah, it's a trap.
It's anti-pattern?
Yeah.
It's a trap card.
Hang on, can I just capitalize on this for a second? Again,
Capitalize.
I'm gonna say.
He's a consultant.
Yeah, I am.
It depends.
The command pattern in here does not match the command design pattern in the Django 4, where you can return an output sometimes. And that's the mistake that people do. They think they're both the same thing, and they think, okay, I'm going to return an output here and it should be fine. The whole concept of this is scalability by separation, segregation. Sorry.
The separation's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So should you be using something like Signal R if you need something on the front end?
So you could. So if you wanted to, let's say you wanted to wait and your command was processed, but you wanted to wait until your views were updated before responding in the UI. You could do that. So you could write your UI so that you send a command and then you immediately subscribe to a view updated event from your read model. And when the read model gets the domain event that says something's happened, then it updates itself, and then it itself publishes an event that says, I've updated with whatever, and you could do it with a saga or like a correlation ID, something like that. So we do all our requests with the correlation ID so that we know what it is that flowed through to the other end. We wait for that to update. We've just got this user request, which is now flushed through here, and that's great. The problem is, over time, how many views of data do you have? So therefore, how do you tell the UI to now not only listen to this view being updated, but this one, and this one, and this one, and it starts getting kind of messy. So it's better to think about it. The command was successful. Update my UI locally if I need to, and just assume that everything's okay because the command worked, and that stuff will flush through. And when you do queries on other pages, for example, that then do a full refresh and load data up, you show an as at time. This is current information as at whenever.
Yeah, so if you had a local database and you're actually doing the commands into a local database, then you could display that state from a local database, and then you could send the command off to the server. So you can have the same command on the client in a local database, and then you've updated your local one, sent the command to the server, which is the same command, and then when you synchronize
So the
back
problem there is one of the things commands should do is check that the command is valid. If you're doing it locally, you're effectively just caching the command. You're not actually validating that the command's going to work. Because it's not until it gets to the back end where the single source of truth is and we've got all the other user inputs, we go, hang on, you can't actually update this account because the thing's not validated, even though you thought it was. And
But you can do the command to the server first and then do the command locally.
Next question.
Speaking of validation, if you need
Yes.
to execute some queries, potentially joins,
Yep.
as part of the command, would you run those against the normalized storing as opposed to your denormalized eventual consistent?
If to validate a command I need to query some data, would I do it against the query views or against the domain model? What would you suggest? Anyone? I'm updating the domain model, so I want to query the domain model. So I want to do it against that. So I won't go against the query views for that.
Small question: if we this validation stuff,
Yep.
if we need to return like several errors, how do we do it with command? Because essentially we throw only one exception.
So,
So an
okay.
aggregate exception.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's this thing called an inner exception.
Yeah.
No one reads it though. You ever watched anyone else debug and you see them with the error on the screen telling them what's wrong? And they just don't read it and they click next, 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 next and just stop and hit F5 again and you're just like, no, it's just Aaron that does that. All right, so commands and queries will eventually lead to what we call a task-based UI because we're now starting to think about user actions and intention. Interesting. If you start thinking about UIs that are no longer data grids pointed to stuff, thank goodness those don't tend to happen so much anymore. But we end up then with task-based UIs where our UI is built around this idea of user takes an action, user queries data. And it changes the way, again, that you approach things and becomes a more usable user interface. Even without getting a UX expert, it's just more usable because it matches the user's flow of operation better. So what's the catch? CQRS does mean you need to think about your design and domain model. Bugger. I just want to come into work and write code and do inserts in the database. Now you're going to make me think? Oh, Richard. That said, if you are doing that cruddy application, don't worry about it. Keep doing it. It's not a problem. It's a valid business application. It's not an interesting one. And if you were doing that, to be honest, I would use something like LightSwitch. Or I'd suggest at least looking at it. Because why do I want to write custom code that just does forms over data? I might as well use MS Access or LightSwitch or whatever else. That's what it's there for. Commands are not fire and forget. Some people think you send off the command and you don't worry about the return value. But there is an implicit return value, right? Exception or no exception. So you need to pay attention. Yes?
Well, it just kicks off a workflow. So return value just means, thank you, I accepted your command.
That's fine. The command succeeded, right? You started the workflow. At that point, you would then have other operations occurring, and then you'd be making queries to see where is this at in the workflow now. You do need to think about concurrency. If I'm updating domain objects, and other people are making commands on those same domain objects, what happens? Do I make it restrictive so that it is a single update? Or do I allow things like the HTTP patch verb? Or I can have two commands going, as long as they don't conflict with each other, that's okay. I can let that through. And then multiple people we can have what's called a collaborative domain at that point. where multiple people can work on something like a Word document. You know, you go into Google Docs or Word Online or whatever else and you have multiple editors. As long as they're not working on the same paragraph, they can both make changes. No problem. That's done kind of like that. Bless you. All right, you need to figure out how you want to denormalize your data, as we talked about before. Think about performance and the types of queries you're going to have. And eventual consistency, if you end up going down that path, it's not simple. I don't know that I can say that clear enough. It's not simple. It's going to be much easier if you just want, if you're building a monolith in particular, to stick all your views in the same database as your domain model as just separate tables. Because then you can wrap it in a single transaction, you can make it immediate, you can make it all synchronous, and you don't have to worry about all the eventual consistency pain. If you do go down that path, you have to think then again about UI issues, about what you do with commands that get delayed responses, what happens when the event listeners aren't running, what happens when the message bus is turned off and all the commands are putting messages in the message bus, but nothing's actually transferring them to the recipients. So there's all these things to consider. And it's really easy to fall back into old habits. You know, if you've been writing code for as long as I have, then it's at least 500 years. You have a lot of bad habits to fall back onto, and very few good habits in general. So it's really easy to fall back onto those. So it takes discipline, and one of the best things you can do is make sure someone else is peer reviewing your code and picking you up when your commands are starting to either return data or don't feel like commands anymore. Or your queries start doing side effects and changing state because it just was easier this time. And if you've got a legacy system, it is hard to put this in. Basically because anything in a legacy system is hard. In general. It's also complexity you might not need, so if your domain model is not complex and you don't have a lot of behavior in it, simple CQRS without splitting the objects up might be enough. Just that simple separate methods for commands versus reads is a good start. So why use it? So if you've got a complex domain model, as I mentioned, that's a good thing. If you've got scalability or performance issues you want to deal with, it's a good thing. If you want to build a task-based UI, it aligns well with that. So it's a pattern that makes sense from an implementation perspective. And if you've got a collaborative domain model, it's also a good thing to use there, as we've talked about. So, we're done.